what's going on in the West Asia. And the United States is escalating the situation, attacking the bridges, as we've learned in the last 48 hours. The city of Bandar Abbas, somehow they're trying to isolate the city. All of these bridges around Bandar Abbas were hit by, they used the fighter jets to hit those targets, the bridges, which is so important. Bandar Abbas, when it comes to the operation in the Persian Gulf, is so important in the Strait of Hormuz. And this is the escalation. This is the way that the United States is escalating. And looking at the way that the United States is escalating, somehow it's trying to hit the bridges, and somehow some cities I don't know if you followed 2 days ago, they started using HIMARS in Kuwait at the border with Iraq. They hit many targets in the state of Khuzestan. So that was we had the HIMARS in Bahrain. It seems that the Iranian response was somehow effective in destroying those HIMARS in Kuwait and Bahrain. And right now the attacks are happening using fighter jets. How do you see the current situation and the way that the United States sees the war?
Clearly, we're seeing an escalation, but also an escalation that is now starting to at least give the impression of a pattern. In the beginning, it was frankly even a bit confusing to the Iranians because they didn't quite understand what the plan behind some of these bombings were. A lot of the targets are not of particularly strategic importance, certainly not strategically decisive. And even when some of the targets that were strategically very crucial, such as the railway that went to Mashhad, it was struck in a manner that within 24 hours it was repaired. It did not seem to have been deliberately destroyed. Deliberately had avoided destroying it. So it was unclear. Now, in the last couple of days, we're starting to see a pattern that seems to suggest, again, a bit speculative, but seems to suggest to prepare the ground for something bigger in the south. The south of Iran, the entire coastline, is, of course, the critical area in which the Iranians have been able to close the Strait of Hormuz. It's not just a couple of islands or so. It's because of a massive capability that they have built throughout the entire coastline. To completely close that down does not, one idea is to go in with a full-scale invasion. There is nothing that suggests that the type of preparation for such a full-scale invasion in any way, shape, or form has been done. And if it was done, it would take months for it to be ready. However, the manner in which some of the bombings are now taking place seem to suggest, or it could at least be used to allow for a quick, not even an invasion, but essentially an elite force going in with a quick extraction, meaning that they quickly leave as well. But they would use their presence on the ground to do far more damage than just the bombings can do, but then quickly leave again. Because holding territory does not make any sense. They would just be targets and it would be very dangerous. Same is true as to why the United States did not try to take any of the islands. Taking the islands is frankly not that difficult. Holding them and not suffering massive casualties is the difficulty part. And if you look at how Trump has approached this so far, he's been very careful to avoid a large number of American deaths or casualties. But this would nevertheless be a break from that pattern to a certain extent, because even an elite force going in would very likely bring about at least a much higher casualty rate than what we have seen so far. Now, what would the point of all of this be? If this is what the direction is, that seems to then be aimed at making sure that it is a much more significant degrading of Iran's ability to close the strait. Already we've seen that before the MOU and during the MOU, the US was trying to establish a southern corridor in Omani waters that would be militarily fortified, and as a result, the Iranians would not have the same ability of closing that. So if war resumed, part of the strait would still be open. You take that in combination with what this could then be an effort to really deeply degrade Iran's ability to close the strait, and then you're starting to see a clearer picture of a military reopening of the strait as a whole, which would be nevertheless different from an attempt to overthrow the regime or to do the type of regime change operations that clearly was part of the plan earlier on in the first war in February. Having said that, this may be the American plan. I still find it very difficult to see how it would be successful. I think it would bring about a huge risk of large number of casualties, would make it more difficult to go back to the negotiating table. And also, I think once you actually have ground troops, even if it's elite forces in a very small number on Iranian soil, it will fuel nationalism beyond what we saw even in February. And that is also something I think the US side miscalculated or underestimated back in February, and it appears to be another count of underestimation now.
Yeah. I think it depends on when it comes to the tolerance of the two sides. The United States basically is using GCC countries to attack Iran, and Iran's response goes to the GCC countries. They're hitting some targets, as we've learned moments ago or 2 hours ago. Kuwaiti government has announced that Iran has hit one of their major power plants and the desalination plant, which they started rationing the power right now in Kuwait, which is a major issue, it seems. And how do you see that point of tolerance on the two sides? What would be that moment that someone maybe in GCC countries says, we're done, we're not going to do that? You remember the Operation Freedom that the United States started before the MOU, signing the MOU. Is that going to happen again?
So that is one scenario, a scenario in which essentially some of these GCC states say no to the US. But keep in mind, which GCC state said no to the US? It was Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is in a completely different dimension of power than Kuwait. Kuwait is completely dependent on the United States. Kuwait exists because of what the US did in the first Persian Gulf War, when the US, together with the UN coalition, expelled Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. So we're talking about a country that has very little leverage over the United States. Same is true for Bahrain at the end of the day. So the likelihood of that scenario, I find smaller than the likelihood of the opposite happening. That you actually have now a situation in which some of the GCC states are now, the balance of their frustration, they're frustrated with the US, they're frustrated with Iran. In previous episodes, particularly in the beginning of the war, it was very clear the balance of frustration was with the US. They were very upset with the US. The entire situation was bad. You know, at one point you saw that the Omani foreign minister wrote this very harsh op-ed in The Economist, essentially saying that the United States has allowed its foreign policy to be dictated by Israel. These are very harsh words, particularly coming from Oman, which otherwise has been so quiet, so discreet, always operating behind the scenes, never trying to get attention to itself. That balance has now really shifted. There is much, much more anger at Iran than it is at the US at this moment. There is anger because they believe that the Iranians should not have attacked the ships during the MOU with the strikes. And as you remember, they were mostly GCC ships. They believe that this was an overreaction. They believe that the Iranians closed the strait too fast, so that the Iranians moved up the escalation ladder much, much faster than what they'd done before. There was a meeting in Muscat, as you remember, 10 days or so ago, that unfortunately failed. They did not reach a deal. But the Iranians apparently bombed Oman immediately afterwards, just hours after the foreign minister had been in Muscat. So there is also a scenario now that in which many of these GCC states are believing that the Iranians are too aggressive. And as a result, also you're seeing a bit more of a coalescence in which some sort of a GCC unity, which frankly, throughout the war, we hardly saw any of that at all. On the contrary, it was massive disunity. It was during the war that the Emiratis pulled out of OPEC. It is, it's after the war, but nevertheless, we just saw that the Saudis have stopped payment connections to the UAE, etc. So there was a lot of tensions. The Emiratis were trying to convince the Saudis and others to actually join the war. They didn't. There was a very divided GCC. Now it seems to be coalescing at least to a certain point, and much of it is because of anger at the Iranians. I have to say one thing here, though. I personally do think that the Iranians striking at the ships, particularly on the second episode, I think was an Iranian overreaction. I think what they see was not incorrect. There was an effort by the United States to create this southern corridor. And that is a threat to what the MOU was supposed to do, because the MOU was supposed to be a negotiation for the final arrangement. If the US simultaneously is using its military to create a separate corridor, then what's the MOU negotiations for? So, simultaneously with the MOU, the US was trying to create new facts on the ground. And the Iranians see that clearly as a threat and as a challenge. I think that's understandable. How you react to it, however, could be many different ways. And that reaction, particularly in the second instance, I think was an overreaction by the Iranians. But at the same time, why did the GCC states, Saudi, Emirates, and Qatar, allow for their ships to go through the strait in the southern corridor with their transponders off during the funeral of Ayatollah Khamenei, knowing very well the Iranians would see that as a provocation, knowing very well that it would lead to some sort of a confrontation? Now, perhaps they didn't expect the Iranians to shoot, but nevertheless, why do it? So I think all sides have to really assess and reassess how they themselves acted. This is not to justify what the Iranians did, but at the same time, what was the thinking behind this? You knew very well that there would be some sort of a crisis that would emerge out of this. And at the same time, you probably were under pressure from the United States to do this. And certainly the Omanis were under pressure from the United States to open their channel and walk away from the Omanis' own proposals, such as a joint management, such as environmental fees and stuff. These are all Omani proposals. So I have no doubt that there was a lot of pressure on the Omanis to move away from that. And there were some pressures on the Qataris and others to challenge the Iranians by sending through these ships. But then you also know that if you cave to that pressure from the United States, you can just be angry at the Iranians because you yourself caved to something that you probably recognize was not the smartest thing to do. Because if it wasn't, there was no need for US to pressure you to do this. You would be doing this on your own. But you did it because you were pressured, so you recognize that this was not something that was the smartest. So I think many sides in this committed mistakes of different degrees. And I find it really problematic, not to say that there was an inevitable likelihood of success. There wasn't. But there wasn't also an inevitable likelihood of failure, of a collapse of the MOU. I think there was a high risk that it could fail, but it wasn't inevitable. But these different actions now more or less turn them inevitable.
I think MOU is turning, I don't know if you follow the news in Iran, but if you follow them, they were basically, there was some sort of fight inside Iran because of the MOU. There were people to the right, to the more conservative, they didn't see anything coming out of the MOU. And unfortunately, what has happened with the case of the MOU is proving them to be right. And it's saying, we told you that you're going to negotiate with the United States. They're not going to respect any sort of negotiations. Because right after signing the MOU, the United States made a new move in Lebanon. Yes. The MOU between Israel and Lebanon. What was that all about? Because the war was between the Israeli government and Hezbollah. How do you understand that?
Yeah. So a couple of points on this. Let me first address the first critique there, which is that the US would not negotiate in good faith, and as a result, you shouldn't sign an MOU. I can understand that given the experience of Iran, undoubtedly, to truly just naively believe that negotiations are all going to be done in good faith would be irresponsible. But you also have to be careful. So what is the alternative? Because if there is no negotiations at all, there's going to have to be total war. And that is not something that ultimately will work either. There has to be a recognition that at some point you do have to go to the negotiating. This is the mirror image of the argument on the American side, which is you can't negotiate with Iranians. They're always dishonest. They will never uphold their agreement. That is an argument that on this side is deliberately put forward in order to go towards an endless total war. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the intent of those on the Iranian side that are putting forward that argument, but the outcome is pretty much the same, because you're not going to have a scenario in which the war ends in a manner that it is not a negotiation and the US just leaves. That's just not going to happen. That's extremely unlikely. So at some point, there's going to have to be negotiations, and then you're going to have to deal with this argument. Can you deal with the other side? What are the mechanisms that should be put in to do so? One of the huge flaws of the MOU, and perhaps this is too harsh of a critique because MOUs do not necessarily usually have this. And if I'm not mistaken, even the JPOA, as you know, the interim agreement before the JCP, I'm not even sure if it had it. But this did not have an observation or a compliance mechanism, in the sense that there would be an IAEA or some sort of other entity in which, if there are disputes over interpretation, etc., you take it there to resolve it. That type of a mechanism was that it would be external. It wouldn't just be a bilateral thing between the US and Iran. So when you say, look, you can't negotiate with the Americans, or the Americans say you cannot negotiate with the Iranians, well, if you truly believe that, then you would work to make sure that there's as many of these different mechanisms as possible to resolve those issues. But when you have none of them and you don't push for any of them, then you can't at the same time come back and say, well, you can't negotiate with the other side. Yet we did this deal which had no compliance mechanisms whatsoever. So that's on the first part. On the other part, which I think is a very important issue that you raised, yes, you had the Lebanese-Israeli agreement, and you also had something that has been less attention given to, which is that Rubio showed up out of nowhere in the Persian Gulf, met with the GCC states, and got all of them to sign on to a statement that completely contradicted many of the positions that others there had taken. So suddenly now you had the Omanis saying that essentially the only acceptable outcome is to go back to what it was before February 27th in the Strait. So as I mentioned, the Omanis had floated the idea of joint management. They had floated the idea of an environmental management fee. So now they were coming on to Rubio's position, which was frankly not even the position of the US in the MOU negotiations, in which he said nothing else is acceptable but February 27th. No fees, no tolls, nothing. No different management, none of that. Here's where the problem is. You can look at that position, you can say, well, look, that's not an invalid position to take. But it is invalid if you signed an MOU that said you're supposed to be spending the next 60 days to come to a compromise. If you, after you sign that agreement for a compromise, for a path towards a compromise, you stake out and say, no compromise, that's our position, then you're contradicting the MOU. It is not in and of itself like a death knell to the MOU, but it's a very significant paper cut. And then he flies to Lebanon, and then they mediate this agreement that also completely contradicts the MOU, because the MOU says that there's going to have to be a regional ceasefire. The sovereignty of Lebanon has to be respected in this context, which is very clear. It means you cannot have Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. But then they signed this agreement between the Israelis and the Lebanese, which again is a different part of the Trump administration. It's the Rubio White House, State Department. And that one says that there's not going to be any withdrawal from Lebanon by the Israelis until Hezbollah is disarmed. There's no talk about disarming Hezbollah in the MOU. And since Hezbollah won't be disarmed unless there's a civil war, that means that you're not going to have the Israelis leave the territory, which then again completely contradicts the parameters of the MOU. So you saw very quickly that there were efforts, and in my reading, at least this is my assessment, that these were deliberate efforts by a different side of the Trump administration to undermine the MOU, but not do so in such openly blatant manner, but in a manner that almost looks as if you're strengthening the American negotiating position, but in reality, you're not. You're undermining the negotiations. Similar to suddenly coming out and say, okay, let's have a negotiation on the nuclear issue. All kind of options are open. But then once the negotiations start, you say, actually, zero enrichment is our completely uncompromising line. On the surface, it can look as if you're kind of taking a tough negotiating position. In reality, you're invalidating the negotiations. And both of these things happened by Rubio himself immediately after the MOU. And let me just add one other thing. You had public threats by the United States to bomb Oman, which I remember many of us, myself included, thought was probably Trump misspeaking, but it turns out that it wasn't. And you also had private threats of sanctioning Oman if the Omanis continued to put forward compromise proposals. So all of this together, yes, it absolutely in my view, is contradicting the MOU and made things much more difficult. And just as you mentioned that there are different factions in Iran, I think we should recognize that there are different factions in the Trump administration as well.